You sure?
Okay. So we
Such
we
is
are
the joy
rolling.
of your editing facilities, I trust.
Yeah, for videos, I just let it go. I let it hang in the breeze. But for the audio, I can cut and clip and drop. So,
Yeah.
um, do you
So
like my side lighting? Get all that sunlight.
it's very dramatic. It's
Yeah.
very dramatic. You should wear sunscreen just on that side of your
I know.
face.
There we go.
John,
Go on, go on.
oh, I'm really looking forward to delving into some of the kind of lyrical and text questions that we have. I wanted to just get a sense of how we should introduce you and you know
I
what
think
your
John
title
is fine. I mean, yeah, because I mean that's how I've been on the podcast for about 4 years now. I mean, I think first made contact with you quite early on, and
Yeah, I think you
I've
were
been
one
listening
of the first. Yeah.
religiously every week.
Nice.
And are you what is your position within the church?
I am a vicar, which means
Vicar.
that I have a very old church, built in 1284. That it started. It's quite a big church, just the other side of well, around the corner, across the road from here. And I've took a service this morning, and I shall be back this evening for a service of sung evensong with our robed choir. It's all very traditional.
Wow.
Yeah,
When
I mean, we're very proud of our choir. I mean, before COVID, we had 3 trips, 2 in 2019 to Westminster Abbey and St Paul's Cathedral. But
Wow.
even better for me was we went to St George's, Windsor, which is where Harry and Meghan got married, and we were there 10 days after the wedding. And I sat in the same seat that George Clooney sat in the choir. So.
It was still warm. a
Still
little
warm,
bit.
it was, yes, yeah. There was just that smell of Clooney about it.
Radiating Clooney.
My bottom has touched the same bit of wood as his bottom.
I mean, that's more than I can say. So.
When I was studying in London, I used
Yeah.
to go occasionally to, I think it was St. Mark's for Vespers, because they always
right.
just had such fabulous music.
Yeah, I think actually church music is coming back into fashion in lots of ways, and I think music is being seen, particularly with younger people, as being a way of involving people and involving youngsters, and I think we're sort of moving away a bit from thinking it all has to be worship bands and guitars and everything, to actually saying there's a lot of really good music, and actually making
Yes.
music together
Yes.
is such a powerful experience for people. So
Yeah, and composing it.
wow. yes. I know somebody who writes quite good music that I enjoy a lot. We could talk about that maybe.
Sure. Shall we jump in?
Sure.
Omen, take it away.
Oh yeah. Gosh.
I mean, I
have
can do
to-
the intro, but you always do. So.
I just have to remember how to do it.
This will be for a Feckless, so it doesn't require that
Yeah.
much.
Welcome everyone. I am Omen Thomas Sade.
And I am Nick Magill,
Together we are the Feckless Momes,
and this, my friends, is Feckless.
the podcast where we talk about whatever pleases us. And today we have a very special guest joining us for this Feckless.
We do.
We'd like to welcome John, the vicar from England, and more importantly, our Patreon Discord chat.
And our hearts. He's the
And,
vicar of our hearts.
and
I
our
would
hearts
say.
as well.
Yeah.
I
Welcome,
hope
John.
I'm going to get the Queen and Country sting at some point.
Oh, yes.
All right. Put it
Absolutely.
in. Noted. That's
Now-
right. I think I used to play that for you, didn't
You
I?
did,
I
you
forgot
did.
all about that.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Now, John, I have
writing that down.
to ask before anything else. How many times has Nick said the vicar to the nun on the podcast
It's
Oh, I don't know.
and made you think, oh dear?
Not well. I don't think I've ever thought, oh dear. No, I don't. Doesn't worry me.
Well,
Wonderful.
it's fantastic to have you here. It's we're so grateful that you were able to take some time out of your day, and we've been talking about the zealot gene and all of the relevance to the Bible, and
Yeah. I've
I'm
been
really
impressed, Omen. I really have by the sort of depth of insight that you've already shown. And I began to think, particularly listening, the last podcast was Mine is the Mountain. I thought, I'm wasting my time even suggesting coming to talk to you guys, because you really are, very much on it, I think, and lots of thoughts that I must admit I would share in the approach to the Bible that you're talking about, seeing it very much as a story that you enter into, and I get, obviously I'm coming from a position of faith, but still, it's about making it your story from my point of view, rather than getting sort of too hung up about the sort of literalness, the historicity of it, or whatever. So I think that using it creatively, and that's partly why I really like what Ian Anderson has done in writing the songs, because I think the way he's used the Bible verses as a jumping off point is really, I think it's great. I mean, I want to steal some of his ideas, for just to slip in quietly in some of the things that I say. So that's fine. Not telling anybody where they come from.
Are your services going to hear any Jethro Tull tracks in the near future?
There might be the odd allusion here and there. Yes.
What about for like a Sunday school? Would you bring in the youth by playing Jethro Tull?
I don't think so.
No. I don't think that's the way to bring in the youth, Nick.
No, not at all. I did send a copy quite randomly of Zealotgene to my former tutor when I was at university, who actually is a Scot, and he's a contemporary of Ian Anderson, but I don't think he's ever really encountered Jethro Tull. And I got a really nice reply from him at the time, and then a couple of weeks ago, he emailed me and said, I didn't really say thank you for Zealotgene, and I'm going to, I've been sitting down and listening to it and just saying how good it is. So
awesome.
I think that's really nice. Yeah. But from my point of view, I guess, one of the great things that you guys have done is really made me listen properly to the music of Jethro Tull, because I think for me it has been the lyrics that have always excited me. There's some great bits of music, but you've made me listen much more carefully and to notice things that I had never noticed over 50 years.
Well, that's something that we appreciate so much about the work of Jethro Tull and Ian Anderson, is that it is so complex on both the text side of things and the music side of things, that there are plenty of people who just listen to it to the lyrics, or just listen to it for the music, or who, we often have the experience of, for this song I've never even listened to the lyrics, but I love the sound of it, or the opposite. And so it's an interesting exercise for us to really bring those two worlds together.
Yeah, and you do it well.
Thank you. I think Zealotgene in particular, I think we've mentioned a couple of times so far, is that it's one of the stronger albums that ties the music really specifically with the story and with the overall feel of the song. I mean, maybe I've missed it in the past, but I think it feels like it's not just kind of consequential, coincidental going on. It fits well, but I mean, it really is giving us that feeling and that atmosphere as well.
And for the Zealotgene in particular, we have a triumvirate. We have the music, we have the lyrics, and then we have the specific verses contextualized in the Bible that Ian is referencing.
That's right.
Now, John, one thing that I struggle with when thinking about the Bible or trying to interpret the Bible at all, which is something I do exceedingly rarely, being not a Christian, but is the issue of translation. Because, I know that there has been such an immense history of translating the texts to and from different languages. I know that Erasmus in the 1300s, maybe around the same time that your church was being founded.
Probably a bit later, I think, for Erasmus. But
a little bit later.
But we'll look on Wikipedia later and check it out. Yeah.
I know that one of his big projects was learning all of the languages that he could that his source texts were coming from, because he was finding that there was a big disconnect between the Latin version of the day and the older Greek version.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you could give us like a very brief Reader's Digest version of, what are the languages that influence the Bible, and how did we end up with the versions that we have today?
Okay, I'll do my best. I mean, the New Testament's written in a form of Greek, and Greek was the common language of the ancient world, certainly the Eastern Mediterranean. And if, even the Romans who occupied Palestine would have had to have learned Greek on a day-to-day basis if they weren't speaking it already to talk to people. Jesus's sort of language at home was probably Aramaic, which is basically a Syrian language, and there are a few odd words of Aramaic in the New Testament. Talitha Kumi is a phrase that comes to mind, which when Jesus, I think, raised a girl from the dead and then speaks to her, and it's translated, and it says, I can't even remember what the translation is, but there is a Syrian Orthodox church that still has as its church language Aramaic. Which is this ancient. So when they read the Bible, it says, "Little girl, come here," which translated means "little girl, come here," because it's a translation into their own language. If that makes any sense. But anyway, and so the Old Testament, certainly there are the Hebrew scriptures, which are written in Hebrew, and for Jews. The first 5 books of the Bible are certainly the most significant, but then there's also the writings and the histories. And the first Christians, because mostly they weren't Jewish, I mean, certainly after the original years and when Paul was going out, were actually reading the Old Testament in Greek. And there was a translation of the Old Testament which was done in Egypt. The legend is that 70 scholars all went off into different rooms and all came back with the same translation, and so it's actually called the Septuagint or the Septuagint, and that was so when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it's quoting it in Greek from a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And there are actually more books in that Greek translation than there are in the Hebrew Bible, and that's why you get a difference between Protestants and Catholics. So Catholics have actually got more books and more text in some of the books than Protestants do. And what our Church of England, tends to do is to take all those extra bits, as it were, and stick them in a bit in the middle called the Apocrypha. So things like there's a whole Susanna and the Elders is a story that is in the book of Daniel. This is where these sort of 2 dirty old men see Susanna bathing.
You have my attention, John.
Well, they see her bathing, and basically they try and blackmail her into having sex with them on the basis that they will claim that. Well, whatever. Anyway, but that's a story that is not in the Hebrew Bible, but it is in the Greek translation, and the texts kept growing, kept being added to.
Yes.
Yeah, and so the books were never closed, really. Certainly the Old Testament wasn't closed probably until a couple of centuries after the birth of Christ. And I think it was really, I think the pressure for Jews to sort of close their scriptures was actually the rise of Christianity, because they were wanting to distinguish themselves from this new sort of heretical sect that was emerging.
That makes a lot of sense. You have to define what you are, otherwise you could get diluted.
Yeah, and similarly with the New Testament, I mean, there were books that were sort of on the fringes that were included and weren't. There was, I mean, the Book of Revelation was contentious. Really early on. Eventually, it was included, largely because of the tradition that it was written by the Apostle John. And we'll come, perhaps, if we ever get as far as the fishermen of Ephesus, eventually, to part of that story. But actually, the Book of Revelation and the Gospel of John, if you look at the language they're written in, the sort of style of the language, they're very, very different. I mean, and they're just the sort of grammatical use of language, let alone the content, which is wildly different, suggests, from a literary point of view, that they were written by different people.
Well, it's like when you read Shakespeare and then you read some of the Shakespeare-adjacent stuff, or the plays where the scholars think that he contributed to some parts but not others. Yeah. You can really tell. You read a line, you think that doesn't smack of that voice.
So, in terms of, I mean, everything was handwritten, of course, and so I think the earliest bit of the New Testament is from John's Gospel, and it's been dated to about 150 A.D. and it's in a library in Manchester. Don't ask me how it's ended up there, but the Rylands Library in Manchester, and it's just this sort of little fragment of parchment with writing on both sides, and because you can sort of line it up almost like a jigsaw piece on the text. But I would like to know I can't remember when the oldest complete manuscript. We're probably talking about 500-600 A.D. But because there's quite a large quantity of manuscripts, you can sort of trace back and trace family trees, and there's a whole science of working out the sort of mistakes that people make when they're copying.
Yes,
and there's a hapax legomena, and which is where. That's probably the wrong phrase. But there you can skip a line because the same word is in that line up there and that line, and you miss the bit in the middle.
Oh, I've already done it, and so
and you jump
ahead.
But equally people do the opposite, which is they write the same line twice.
And some of these people who were copying it, because I know there's a long tradition of, you have to recreate it. This is pre-printing press. Yeah. And my understanding is that some of those individuals weren't even literate. They were copying the shapes of the letters.
Well, and there can be some advantages in that, because if you're literate, you sometimes think, oh, that's not right, I'll correct it.
Right.
But then you're actually correcting it to something that's wrong because you misunderstood it. So
it's the telephone game over thousands and thousands of years. Yeah.
Send 3 and 4pence. We're going to a dance is the traditional one that I cite, which is send reinforcements. We're going to advance.
Okay. So there must have been
in the trenches in the First World War. Yeah,
there have been all this whole process, and it sounds like in some ways the Old Testament was a living document for a while, and the New Testament was a living document for a while. At what point did the Bible, in the version that we are aware of it today, when did that kind of become codified or set?
They talk about the canon of the New Testament, the canon of the Old Testament, and I guess within the first 4 centuries, it was all sort of finely nailed down. I say, apart from this slight disparity, because the Vulgate, the Latin translation, which traditionally St. Jerome translated while sitting in a cave in Bethlehem, and next door to the traditional birthplace of Christ.
Wow.
And had a lion for company as well. But that's another story. But that translation was the standard translation for the Roman Catholic Church right through to the Middle Ages, and so when people even suggested there was something wrong with that translation, which inevitably there was, because no translation is perfect, people got very up in arms just because that was the Bible that they knew.
And that's what Erasmus was doing.
Yeah.
He was trying to...
Well, and what he did, was to go back to the Hebrew text, and that was the thing at the Reformation. So that's why Protestant Bibles tend to be based on the Hebrew text, whereas the Roman Catholic Bible had been based on a Greek translated into Latin, and then they've kept the content as far as possible, even when it's gone back to the Hebrew text. But there are textual variants. That's the point, and so there is no perfect manuscript, and there's a whole scholarship of actually saying, well, what's the most likely word this would have been here? And usually it's the most unlikely word, because you're more likely to change from something odd to something you understand than the other way round, because there's no reason to change it. but also the whole business of translation. There is no
Yes.
there's no
Very
logical
sticky.
equivalence between ideas expressed in words in one language and the ideas expressed in words in another language. So they're never going to quite fit. And also, the hapax legomena, which I said before, actually means a word that only occurs once, and
Ever.
ever. So,
Okay.
so what does it mean? We've only seen this. We've got no other context for
Yeah.
this word. So
Yeah.
you're trying to guess from the words around
Right.
what it might, what's the most likely. But how else do you know? It's only
Yeah.
and there are many instances of that in ancient languages.
That's when you have a word and somebody says, "Can you use it in a sentence?" and you say, "Only once."
Yes, right. But also context is important. You
Yes.
mentioned, Omen, the other day about the word that's often translated as homosexual in Bible, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it does not mean what you and I might think about a loving relationship between two equal partners of the same sex. Because the social context of the ancient world didn't allow that. That just wasn't on the table, and so the thing that was being railed against is pederasty, which, as you rightly identified, and it's an unequal relationship between a powerful male with a male slave or an adolescent, and it's about non-consensual sex from an older man to a younger man, and I don't think that's right either. But it's not the same thing.
No, it's not the same thing as a
thing at
consensual.
all.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's one of those things that is so fascinating about translation and, like you say, context, because there are some mistranslations or alternate translations that don't affect the meaning that much. There's an example. My grandfather was something of a biblical scholar, and that's where
I ask you about this. Yeah.
that's where a lot of
it's all coming out now. Yes, right. Okay.
and he was also a multilinguist. He was a polyglot. He grew up in Tehran in Persia, spoke 4 or 5 languages really well, and was a devout Christian. And he would do his own translations of things. And there was a phrase, I don't know if it's in the Old Testament or the New, but I think the phrase is, "It is as easy, or it is as difficult for a rich man to get into heaven as it is for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle."
That is the New Testament, and it's a teaching of Jesus. Yeah.
Okay, great. So my grandfather looked at that, and he said, this image of a camel passing through the eye of a needle never really made sense to him. He went back to some version of the text and discovered, I think this is a mistranslation. The word for camel and the word for rope are very similar.
Yeah.
And the phrase, the image of trying to pass a rope through the eye of a needle, actually makes a lot more sense. Because a camel, of course, you could never, there's no way. But the action of trying to get a rope, and that is more related to a thread. Anyway, I don't know.
I've heard that theory. Yes, I mean, with all due respect, I don't think it's unique to your grandfather. So
No,
sorry to
certainly.
disappoint you. But
No.
but equally, there's another sort. I mean, that may or may not be right. But there's another idea that the Eye of the Needle was a sort of common name for a gate in the city walls of Jerusalem. But I mean, there's no evidence for that. There's no historical evidence. And
either way, it doesn't really matter. The image is clear. It's difficult for.
But I think for me, one of the things that I love about Jesus' teaching is that he has this fantastic sense of humor. That he goes for these mad images that make no sense. I mean, and so it may be that he was talking about a thick rope going through a needle. Yeah, that's about. But I could love that idea of trying to push a camel through the eye of a needle. I mean, why not?
Yeah. And in that case, whichever translation you go with doesn't really affect the meaning in the same way that translating pedophilia to homosexuality does. That has social ramifications.
Yes, it certainly does. Yeah,
it's interesting to see the different levels of transliterative choice. Is that a phrase I can use?
Well, and it's also about how you use the Bible, because too often it's used by devout Christians as a sort of big stick with which to mostly hit other Christians, but sometimes to hit people who are not Christians, and that really isn't, I think, what it's there for.
So that's a great pivot point to talk about the way that Ian Anderson has approached this text. Nick, you read this beautiful quote from Ian where he said, "I know that this is a losing game for me because the regular people will think that I've gone that I've suddenly become an evangelist, and Christians will think that I'm having a go at the Bible, and the truth is none of that.
I'm a professional fence sitter.
Yeah,
that's just this past week. That's from Mine is the Mountain. I read that. Yeah.
So I guess I was curious because John, you might be more familiar. What other traditions exist of a more artistic interpretation of the Bible, and where of those examples, which do you feel are the most provide the best crossroads of really interpreting the meaning of it, but also creating something beautiful and artistic?
Well, I suppose the thing that comes to mind, there've been, historically, there have been all sorts of ways of reading the Bible, and there were, the literal one was often deemed to be the least important, and so allegorical interpretations and like what's called typology, and trying to see parallels, particularly between the Old and the New Testament, and seeing things happen. Like the sacrifice or the near sacrifice of Isaac, where but being prepared to give up your son was then seen as a typology for the sacrifice of Christ. But but one of the things that interested me when I first came across it was the conversations between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien when they were both...
I've heard of this.
Yeah, well, you'll be help fill in the gaps in my recollection, hopefully. But there's a famous conversation that they had, sort of walking around Christchurch Meadow in Oxford, and C.S. Lewis became a Christian because of Tolkien and because of that one of those conversations, because C.S. Lewis, although he was brought up as a Protestant in Belfast, and then they came to school in England, but he said he was always, interestingly, in the context of what happened this week, much more interested in the Norse mythology than he was in the Bible. And that was what excited him and gave him a sense of a sort of longing and a sense of something just sort of intangible beyond his reach. But they talked about myth and myth making, and I think the idea that Tolkien gave to C.S. Lewis was that you think about Christianity or the Christian story as a myth, and you can see parallels with lots of other ancient myths, dying and rising gods and all that stuff.
Yes.
But he said, but this is the true myth. This is the one that the real God, as it were, has revealed. He did put it quite as crudely as that, but that was really what got C.S. Lewis able to write things like the Narnia stories,
which is, of course, a very complex but obvious in some ways Christian allegory.
Yes, yeah. I think Tolkien was a bit snooty about it being sort of too allegorical, whereas he would have preferred something more mythical, which is obviously why all the sort of Lord of the Rings trilogy and all that was written. But beneath that is a Christian sort of, I don't know, substructure. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. The battle. If you go and look at the Silmarillion, which was, which I think was the first thing that Tolkien wrote in that world, which is so funny to me. It's like, I have a story about a little hobbit who finds a magic ring. Hold up. Have to create an entire mythological backstory that is, essentially the size of the Old Testament. And that has to do
J.K.
with...
Rowling has done the same thing. I mean, she has written. She had to create a universe in order for her characters to exist in it. And I mean, I don't think that's wildly common, but in a sense, that's, if you take that back to the Bible, you create a universe for the characters to exist in it, and you then you can be creative with the story. And the thing about the Bible for me is that there is no, I mean, like you guys are always saying about the songs, there are many ways of understanding these things, and everybody who reads, it ought to be, they ought to have the freedom, I think, to read the Bible and actually find what seems to be true in it.
Well, and that's something that Nick, you were raised Catholic, and I was raised in a town where there were, 4 times as many churches as there were gas stations, and a lot of in America, we have the evangelical movement, and my experience growing up was that my experience of Christians growing up was predominantly people saying, no, it's literal, you have to believe exactly this, and there's no room for interpretation. And that really, really turned me off.
It turns me off too. I mean, and we have evangelicals here, and I'm not. I guess I've been through that and come out the other side. Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that I've been really enjoying about looking at the text from the Bible for the purpose of this album is that Nick and I have had all this time interpreting Ian's lyrics, and I think we've started to apply that same technique that we've developed interpreting an artistic work to the Bible.
Yeah.
And suddenly I'm like, oh my gosh, this is great. Whereas before I had a very negative, rigid view of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's some fantastic stories. I mean, the whole sort of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph sequence. I mean, it's amazing, which is why Andrew Lloyd Webber could write a musical, about Joseph the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, or indeed, Jesus Christ Superstar, which was I had for the same Christmas that I had Aqualung. They're my first 2 albums.
Wow, that's quite a combo.
Perfect. Yeah.
Well, it was, My God over here and Jesus Christ Superstar over there,
2 sides of the same coin.
Absolutely.
2 sides of the same vinyl. Yeah.
But what was good, I mean, is that they, I mean, going back to what you're saying, Owen, they both ask questions, and that seems to me to be, you can't get to truth by just being told this is what you have to believe. You have to get there yourself.
We were talking in just the last episode that we recorded that I think is not out yet.
Betrayal.
It was the Betrayal. Oh wait, no. What's the one about?
Oh no, I'm sorry.
Where did Saturday go?
Where did Saturday go? Yeah.
Oh right, you're already into the New Testament stuff. Yeah.
Yes, and one of the things that I found so striking about both Ian Anderson's retelling of the story, but also the Bible's telling of the story, is this sense that nobody knows what's going on.
No.
They all go home for the Sabbath. They go back to the tomb with all the herbs and spices, and they just have they're confronted with just a mystery.
Yeah.
And there's no and in my experience of talking to Christians that I grew up with, it was always, and then Jesus rose and it was this huge glorious thing.
Yeah.
In the Bible, it's this massive moment of doubt. And so one of the things that we talked about in that episode is what is the relationship between faith and doubt. And a lot of people, I think, that I've spoken to seem to see those as diametrically opposed. Yeah. But I think that they're actually almost the same thing. It's
they've certainly got to be held in tension, and you've got to keep. If truth is going to be anything other than superficial, if your beliefs are going to be anything other than superficial, you've got to keep questioning them. I mean, it's in that sense, I don't think it's any different from the sort of scientific enterprise where you're always testing the data, and then eventually you get to a point where something really doesn't fit and really doesn't work, and then you have to have a complete rethink and a paradigm shift and look at things in a completely different way. And I don't think faith is set in concrete because our lives are different. My life is not the same as that of a first century Palestinian Jew or somebody living in this town 700 years ago.
You've got penicillin for one.
Well, yes, but so many things are different, and
Yes.
It means that faith has to change, understanding has to change, belief has to change, in order to stay the same. I mean, that's the paradox.
Yes. Nick, for you, what is the song that you think we've struggled the most with textually?
Oh, that's a good
So far.
question.
So far.
Still got 3 more. I don't know. I think we did pretty good. I think it was probably Betrayal or Where Did Saturday Go? Just the idea of why Judas did what he did.
Well, yeah. But going back to the Saturday thing, I mean, I don't know if you've looked at the end of Mark's Gospel, but there seem to be 3 different endings. And the original ending basically has the women getting to the tomb, finding it empty, an angel talks to them, and then it says they were so frightened they just ran away and said nothing to anybody. Which is what a wonderful way to end your Gospel. That's it.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Exit pursued by bear. It's
Absolutely. But
it's
obviously
almost
that isn't the end of the story, because
Right.
there's a whole lot that happens after that. But the fact that Mark may have actually stopped there is amazing. I mean, and then the fact that other people came along and said, well, we can't really have that. We better write some better endings.
But I guess, I in my experience of writing, I always try to think, okay, what's the purpose of this writing?
Yeah.
What's the purpose? You have to convey meaning, of course,
Yeah.
but that's sort of like, if you're not doing that, then you're not doing anything. So then there's the next level of purpose beyond that. And so if my objective was to get people really hooked with this story, if I was, if in this context of the very early Christians who were like, oh my gosh, people have to know about this, then having that cliffhanger ending is actually a very effective tool for getting people to say, but wait a minute, what happens next? And thinking about it for themselves.
And I mean, there is this, I mean, partly because I preached a sermon on this very text last week, but there's this assumption that somehow Jesus went through and told everybody, oh, by the way, I'm going to be crucified, and I'm going to rise again 3 days after that, and it's all very sort of calm and cool and reasonable. But actually, I mean, whatever Jesus himself thought, and you can speculate about his sort of inner thought processes, which, I mean, one of the things that frustrates me as a 21st century person is there's no psychology in the Bible, because nobody attempts to read people in the way that we do, or to try to understand what's going on in their heads, or at least tell us about it. And that's because, again, that's a whole different culture. We spend
it's very modern.
Yeah, we spend our entire time trying to work out what the other person's thinking. Whereas
people have said that Hamlet is the first example of modern psychology, of a psychological character. And that's 1,500 years on.
But so I mean, if I had to guess and speculate as a 21st century person, I don't think Jesus had in his head everything clear, everything understood, because he wouldn't have been human. And the point about Jesus is that yes, we want to say he's fully God, but that doesn't mean that he has a sort of fully worked out, clear God consciousness. He has to have human understanding and human limitations to be any use to us. Because what's the point of him suffering as some sort of example of how to cope with suffering, if actually he knows it's all going to be fine? It's a different experience.
Wow.
But my point really was to say, there is in Mark's Gospel about halfway through, almost exactly halfway through, something fairly oblique about the Son of Man being killed and being raised to life on the 3rd day. And that's the only mention in Mark's Gospel. And then it's not surprising that people, because again, how do you interpret that? If you've got, somebody says to you, the Son of Man will rise on the third day. Well, if you heard that, what does that mean? What are you going to? You think that's some sort of metaphor for something, But it's only with hindsight that it makes the sense that it does that we read it. So
especially if you're dealing with somebody who has that kind of use of language and that sense of humor, who maybe says things all the time.
Well, and all the time, Jesus, people ask him questions. He never gives them a straight answer. It's always across at another tangent. I mean, it's very Zen in some ways.
I was just going to say, it's a lot like one of those Zen masters who ask a straightforward question. They're like, well.
Yeah, totally.
That's funny.
Well, it's not that far from India, with the trade routes and everything else. Anyway, but there are stories about him going east as a child. I mean, as much as there are stories of legends of him coming to England. But I mean, that's we won't go into that now. That's a whole other story. Came to Glastonbury, where the festival is. Allegedly, but leave that. That's just another rabbit hole to go down.
Jesus actually threw the first rave. That's something that people don't know.
Yeah, very, very certainly. Because that's the great thing about having this huge gap between being, running off to Egypt when he's 2 years old and nothing apart from one story when he's 12, when he gets left behind in Jerusalem. But there's nothing until he's in his 30s. So what did he do?
Yes.
He was a working John and a working Joe, and he was just getting on with his life for most of his time.
Well, and that kind of blank space, Nick and I have talked a lot on the podcast about Ian's writing style and how often Ian doesn't give you, it's a series of 1 through 10. He doesn't give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He gives you 1, 3, 9.
Yeah. And back to 7, 2, 10.
Yeah. And then the human mind, because we are story-making machines.
Yes,
Joseph Campbell talks so much about this.
Confabulation is the word that comes to my mind.
Ooh,
that we have to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
We have to. We do it whether we're aware of it or not. And so to have that 30-year gap in a story is such a fabulous opportunity. Jon Favreau would go nuts with it.
Yeah. Well, and many books and legends and goodness knows what have been used. Jesus has been in all sorts of situations in those years. But anyway, but why not? Imagine those things. And where does it take you to, and what does it make you think? And it's truth. I mean, like the best Ian Anderson song, is many layered. It really is.
Yeah.
But that was Saturday. But you were saying about why did Judas betray Jesus? I mean, that's the subject of so many sermons. I probably preached, but others I've heard preach. I mean, it's a good question.
So one of the things that we discussed was it seems like there are a couple different there are a couple of interpretations that we are aware of.
Yeah, go on.
And one of them that Nick, you brought up, was this idea that Judas actually had gotten on board with Jesus's movement because he believed that Jesus was going to kind of destroy the Roman occupation. That it was almost like this anarchic, very very contextual political moment, and when Judas realized, oh no, he's not the anarcho revolutionary that I thought he was. He's just going around preaching all this love stuff. That was so frustrating that he decided to betray him. And that's an interesting interpretation. I mean, that makes it very modern and very understandable. Nick, what was the other interpretation that we had with that one?
That was the one that's pretty apocryphal. That's like he was in on it. Jesus told him that it had to happen, so he gave him the scoop and said, "Hey, you got to do this for me." And that's actually from we kind of pulled that from the line, "You sealed my fate as goodly Joshua kind." Like, you did this for me so I could be Jesus.
Yes.
And that seems to have some resonance or some backup with the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found. That was and I know it's extremely apocryphal, but the Gospel according to Judas. There is a text that exists that was found, and I don't know what the scholarly decision on that text is, or even what what various sects of the church might think about that. But it's an interesting version of the story. And I wondered if there were any other.
Well, I mean, the idea that again, it goes through the New Testament, because what does it mean to call Jesus the Messiah or Christ? Christ is simply the Greek version of Messiah, which is the Hebrew, which means somebody anointed by God, and the idea that they were waiting for somebody to liberate the people. Just like Moses had liberated the Israelites from slavery in Egypt.
In a more literal way.
Yeah, like Joshua coming and conquering the Promised Land. I mean, the idea of being given Israel was fine, but they actually had to take it by force, and that has modern political implications still.
Oh, yes.
Which we don't need to go to necessarily. Yeah. But also somebody like King David, who was a great fighting king, and again, I mean, certainly initially the enemy of David was the Philistines, and the Philistines and the Palestinians seem to have some sort of historical connection too. So I mean, but the idea of Israel being an occupied, or Judea being an occupied country, and actually having a political leader who would galvanize armed resistance and rebellion.
Yes.
I mean, it actually happened in 70 AD. I mean, and there was a great revolt against the Romans. It ended with mass suicide on Masada, when the Jewish soldiers and their families all killed each other, killed themselves, because they knew it was hopeless. Jerusalem itself was razed to the ground. The temple was burnt, and everybody who was anybody in any sort of position of authority or power was basically exiled from the country, and that was the beginning of the sort of Jewish diaspora. That's why for however many hundreds of years there was no homeland for the Jewish people. So that was the alternative scenario that was tried perhaps 40 years later, and resulted really in catastrophe for the Jewish people. But it's also this business of the kingdom of God, and when you start talking about kingdoms, then people start thinking in terms of politics and armies and goodness knows what else. And
that's exactly what we were talking about earlier on with the literal versus artistic interpretation of things.
Yeah.
It's easy to imagine, when going back to Buddhism, there's a lot of this language of the path of Buddhism is designed to free you from suffering.
Yeah.
To show you that yes, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Yeah. And it would be very easy to misinterpret that to say, oh yeah, this is going to fix all your problems. It's going to take away all your suffering. Yeah, but it's more on a spiritual level. So I can imagine confusion if Jesus was saying, yes, I'm offering you a kingdom of peace, and people say, oh yeah, that sounds good. Right, let's get our swords sharp and go get that kingdom of peace. Whereas, of course, he was talking about the peace in your heart and peace, with how you accept things.
But if you just think about conflicts going on in the world today, and conflicts that have gone on in the last 20 years, our two countries have joined together in attacking Afghanistan and Iraq, and I'm not convinced we've left them better places, despite the good intentions, perhaps, of those who set out to try and bring a better outcome than was there. So, I wouldn't underestimate the value of actually what goes on in your heart, and the way that the idea of each of us as individuals, and as many of us as collectively as possible, living in a way that actually demonstrates what it means to live at peace, and to be able to forgive people, and to love our neighbour as ourselves, and all those things that Jesus taught. They're incredibly powerful because it's about hearts and minds, which you cannot overcome with a bomb and a bullet. You know.
No. Nick, I wanted to see, because I know you have some notes.
I do, and we're very quickly running out of time.
Sorry.
Would you like to get it? Would you like to get a word in edgewise?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I want to bring it back to. No, please. I mean, that's what you're here for. But I want to bring it back to Tull specifically.
What a good idea.
Zealot Gene.
Yes, please.
Zealot Gene in particular. So Zealot Gene drops, 21 years after the last Tull album. You first learn that it's the Zealot Gene. We're going to have a religious context. Silent singing has all of the lyrics before we even get to hear any of the music. What's your thought there? What's your first thought about Ian approaching the entirety of an album like this, given his history, both good and bad? You know?
I must admit, I sort of secretly longed for him to do something like this because, I mean, obviously my introduction, apart from buying the single "Life's a Long Song," was the very first Tull that I ever knew. But my first album was Aqualung, and it had had a huge impact on me as a teenager, and really, really got me thinking. But I mean, there have been, you know, throughout the canon of Jethro Tull, songs where Ian Anderson has talked about Jesus, talked about God, and I mean, I quite like the Divinities recording. You know, there's some lovely things, but where he's always again been sort of poking and pushing about what it means to believe in God and what is the significance of Jesus, and it's usually in a fairly sort of, well, asking the question, you know, if you say you're a Christian believer, but hang on, you know, Jesus over here is saying something quite different from the sort of things that you're doing or saying or thinking. And,
oh yes,
and that's, you know, that's so for him to have actually got a whole album where he's sort of focused on all these things, I loved, and I was really very excited reading some of the lyrics and seeing some of the connections. I mean, I probably touched on it, but the Three Loves Three, I mean, just the whole notion that he picked up that story post-resurrection of Jesus asking Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" was very much the sort of I want to say the cure, but that's not quite the right. But the way of healing the fact that Peter had betrayed Jesus 3 times by saying he didn't know him, and you know, that's just a lovely little thing that obviously Ian Anderson has noticed or has had drawn to his attention, and was able to make that into that lovely song. But there's so many little moments like that.
Yes.
And I mean, like Baron Beth, where
that's my favorite. It's my favorite on the whole album.
Wow.
I'm realizing.
But I mean, I've had about 20 years ago. I had 9 weeks in Israel, and going to Ein Karim, which is the traditional birthplace of John the Baptist, and it's because of the geography of Israel. Jerusalem is on the Judean ridge, so it's high up, and then the western slopes going down towards the Mediterranean Sea is where all the rain falls, and then it's the sort of, as soon as you get to the top of the ridge, effectively all to the east of it is a rain shadow, and you get into the Judean desert very quickly when you go east of Jerusalem, and it actually the land or the ground falls away incredibly quickly in quite a short distance. So you get to the Dead Sea, which is however many 100 feet below sea level. So any rain that does fall on Jerusalem just gushes down at huge speed without barely touching the ground. So this image of John being born in this beautiful valley, and when we were there, all the almond trees were in bloom. It was a beautiful place. And then only really having to walk about 20 miles to the other side of Jerusalem and being in the desert. And that's where he spent so much of his time. But yes, the John the Baptist Jesus thing, I mean, it's a theme through the New Testament, and about John clearly was somebody who had to sort of fairly graciously give way to Jesus, and that's never an easy thing to do. Never to sort of, because he was teaching different things, but recognised that Jesus was actually the one. And he was there to prepare for and to give way to him. I must decrease that you can increase is a line from John's Gospel that he has.
That's so. And just to clarify, because I never quite understood this, John the Baptist is the same as John the Apostle, or are they two different figures?
No. Different, entirely different. No, he was. Because he was beheaded during Jesus' lifetime by Herod Antipas after his stepdaughter Salome did that dance and promised him anything anything she wanted.
Right.
If you know the story, but don't need to elaborate. I'm sure.
Bring me the head of John the.
Yeah.
So, given that we've only had a year off and we're going into Norse mythology with rock flute, how excited are you? Obviously, and we've heard it now. I mean, at this point, it's released. Are you approaching it the same way that you approached Aqualung, or are you approaching it the same way that you approached Zeligene?
I think neither.
Or
neither, truthfully. No, I mean, apart from
neither.
No, I mean, Aqualung, I knew nothing about. And it was a complete revelation. And I mean, one of the things that changed my life. But I mean, I really was looking forward to Zeligene, but not least, as you say, because it felt so long since even Homo eroticus, which, I mean, maybe when they, it's hard in a way to say that's not a Jethro Tull album when it's the same musicians, but...
right.
But, I mean, I've listened probably 3 times now to rock flute. I mean, I've got my rock flute, got my rock flute.
There it is.
But... And there's some lovely things on there, but I suppose, and I have been rereading my Norse mythology and listening to Neil Gaiman's audiobook.
Nice.
Good.
Yeah, to try and I got a free book on Amazon Kindle, which at least explains to me what the 9 worlds are, which I don't think I'd quite got from my childhood reading of the stories. But it's a very long time since I've read any of those stories. So I'm looking forward just for the pleasure of learning more about that world, and obviously it actually, I mean, the Vikings came here. This is the east coast of England. I mean, where my daughter lives in York was the sort of great Viking capital of England, actually. And you can go to the Jorvik Centre and have a multi-sensory experience of the Viking occupation. I recommend it to you if you're ever there. But smells and all, which is great.
That's the best part.
Yeah, but
we're going to release a multi-sensory Feckless Momes experience at some time, but I don't recommend it.
Yeah.
But your question was, how do I feel about the new album, or how do I feel in anticipation? I'm looking forward to getting to know it. But as we all know, if we're fans of Jethro Tull, it doesn't take one listen. It probably doesn't even take 10 listens before you begin to get a sense of, wow, this is actually really, really good.
Yes. The thing that I am excited to try to tease out with those 2 albums and, putting those in the canon of everything else is that mythological approach. And I think that we've talked about the similarities of the dying god being, the god raising from the dead, and all the other tropes and archetypes that exist throughout human mythology. What I appreciate about Ian is that he finds some of those. He takes almost a mythological approach, and that's what I love about some of his the most secular albums, which for me are Catfish Rising. Although we have When Jesus Came to Play, which is a really fun one. Yeah. But even when he's talking about Farm on the Freeway, he talks about the language that he uses and the metaphors that he uses are the same. And so what's so fabulous about the work of Jethro Tull when taken as a whole is that you have the mythological figure of the farmer in Ohio alongside of the mythological figure of Jesus and John the Baptist, and they're kind of put on equal footing. And you can say you can take them all for valuable, and they're all different parts of the human experience, and that's I mean that's kind of what is art.
But also, I mean, from a spiritual point of view, he calls himself a panentheist, or how you pronounce it, but which is basically saying God is in everything, and
Yes.
and that's that. I mean, there are certainly strands within Christianity that would, and particularly sort of Jesuit spirituality in the Catholic Church, that want to see God in all things, and you know, and I think there's great richness in that, in seeing, as you say, that Ohio farmer as much an expression of the divine in some sense as Jesus, and seeing, you know, or at least seeing what is divine about his life, his experience, his being. It rather than sort of saying there's religion over here and everything else over there, and there's no connection at all. I mean, that's crazy if you believe in God, because God has made it all and is in it all and cares about it all. So, I think there's. I mean, I suppose I identify, you know, in terms of life experience quite a bit with Ian. I mean, in that, you know, I'm 10 years younger than him, but school experience was very similar, you know, and growing up in a sort of similar time in Britain, and we've seen where Church of England was the sort of default position for the majority of people in the country. If you went into hospital and they said, "What religion are you?" you'd say C of E and just tick a box. And it didn't actually mean very much. You were very much a sort of cultural Christian. But that has gone, and there are, you know, religion in Britain. I mean, the most religious people are young Muslims probably these days. Certainly much younger people, and so even as a cultural frame of reference, it's pretty much disappeared. If you have quiz shows on the television, you know, people don't even know the most basic Bible stories. And
That's the same here as well, but at the same time, the people who don't know the most basic Bible stories are also saying, well, you know, the Bible says this, and therefore society has to be a certain way. It reminds me, there's a wonderful...
Well, we don't tend to have a religious right here in that sense, thank goodness.
Right.
Nor do we worship guns, but I mean, we'll leave off that as well. You know.
It's 11:08. We do not have time for anecdotes. I'm sorry.
It's a one-line anecdote.
Okay, give it to me. One line.
In a film adaptation of the novel Ivanhoe, there's a wonderful moment where I lied, Nick. So there's all these Christian knights dining in this hall, and a Jew comes and says, "Oh, I'd like to stay the night." And one of the knights stands up and says, "I will not lodge under the same roof as a Jew." And it's the Middle Ages. And the fool, very quietly in the corner, says, "For every Jew you show me who's not a Christian, I'll show you a Christian who's not a Christian."
That's nice.
Yeah.
That's good. I could button it there. I'm so sorry.
You do need to go. Yeah.
This is great. And what else?
And I'm sorry, Nick, that Omen and I seem to have hogged this between us.
I know. I mean, I wish I could give Omen control, and you guys could keep talking. But
no. It's good to have a limit on it. What do you need, Nick, on the editing side to wrap up?
Just a thank you, really. So thank you so much, John. I'm so sorry we have to boogie.
It's good. It is good to have a limit, because it's just a joy talking to you. And
wait, can we have? Oh, so sorry. Can we have a not rushed intro as if it was planned? Outro as if it was planned.
Oh.
Sure. Okay.
Does that sound good?
Go ahead.
John, it's been so fabulous having you here. Thank you so much for taking your evening between services to chat with us. This has been really a valuable insight into the confluence of Ian Anderson and the Bible.
Very fascinating. We could talk for hours more, surely. We've barely scratched the surface.
And I've got all my notes here all prepared and not referred to any of them.
I mean, that's usually how it works.
I
for
thought
us,
it
too,
might
is
be.
like,
Yeah.
I prep here, and then,
Yeah.
then we'll toss them out. It's fine.
Any final thoughts for us, John?
No, it's just I'm really grateful for what you've done over these last 4 and a bit years, and you're still going to be working at the Ian Anderson face for another 2 years at least, isn't it? I mean, and if they keep
least,
churning
yes.
out albums every year, it's never going to end, and that's fine. I'm quite happy with that. But well done
he's
to you
keeping us-
for your dedication to it all.
He's keeping us busy.
Yeah.
Well, until next time, I remain Omen Thomas Sade.
I am Nick Magill,
We've had the pleasure of John the Vicar
and this has been Feckless.
and
Perfect.
and we're spent.
Perfect.
Said the vicar